Hi everyone, welcome to FrankensteinsFabrics Mystery Block 12. This is February's block, which is our circle applique. So what I would like to talk to you about before we get started is that there are three options with this block. There is a needle turn, a quick and dirty visor fix applique, and the bag technique. Now the bag technique is the one that I have used for my block, but I'm leaving it up to you as to which method you prefer to use. Personal preference. If you're more comfortable with one technique than another, by all means use that. So what I'm going to just quickly run through with you before I rejig everything is I'm going to do 3 mini samples. So I'm not going to show you in real size, so please be aware of that. So what you're going to need is, depending on which method, so our first method is our visor fix. So you're going to need a piece of visor fix the size of the circle that you're using. So for the mini one, I'm using a 4-inch circle. If you're going to do needle turn, freezer paper. Now if you've never used freezer paper before, it's a slightly waxy coated paper. It comes in a roll like your cling wrap, so in a box like that you can tear off pieces. The brand I'm using is Reynolds freezer paper. I've had a box since I very first started quilting. It's lasted me all of that time because I don't use it very often. The bagging technique, you will need some fusible interfacing. So if you can see the shiny side here, that's our glue. So I'm using a dark one because I'm using dark fabrics. So they're the 3 materials you will need for your whichever method you choose. Now, the other thing you will also need, depending on how you're going to applique your circle, if you're going to do the visor fix method or you are going to do some form of machine sewing on your circle, you will need some stitch and tear stabilizer. So this is, it just rips. So once it's perforated by stitches, it will rip away, but I'll explain more about that later. And of course you will need your fabrics. So I'm doing some mini samples, so I've just got some scrap here. Now, I am not quilt police. I am not going to judge you if you choose to use certain things for whatever reason you want. But I will say to you, when it comes to picking your threads, it is all about the look you are trying to achieve. So it depends on whether you want it to look flat, high contrast, no contrast, invisible, shiny, variegated, whatever. So if you want to do a flat color for your stitching, so this is all of your machine applique. If you're hand sewing, it won't be seen at all. So if you're doing your machine stitching and you want a flat color, pick something like Rasant, Gutermann, Metler, Olfa, your cotton threads. They're not shiny, they don't have any glitter or anything in them like that, and the color will read as flat on your block. Now, if you want something shiny, go for something like a rayon. So I use a lot of Kingstar. It is a rayon, it's called a, doesn't have it written on here, but it is a shiny thread. It's quite fine. I use it for machine embroidery, but I do use it for applique when I want something with a little bit of glitz. If you want high contrast to your fabric, so for instance, if you've got a red circle and you want it to have an outline so that it's visible, kind of like an outline on a cartoon, use black so that it gives you that really high contrast look. But for this project, I don't mind if you use it on other projects, but for this project, please do not use metallic or monofill. And the reason I'm suggesting that is that I don't want people to struggle with this. I just want you to make the block, finish it. If you would like to experiment later with metallic threads and monofill, by all means, please do. There is no hard and fast rule that I have ever found with metallics and monofill. It is all about putting it on your machine with the most appropriate needle for that thread. So with your metallics, it's usually a top stitch needle because the eye is quite large. and then you just have to play with the tensions and the settings on your machine to get the right fit, because you've got speed control, you've got tension, you've got all sorts of things like that. So what I want you to do is, as much as you might want to do metallic or something like that for this project, please just hold off and just do experiments later. If you choose to use a variegated thread for your applique, please note that there are two methods that they dye variegated threads in, and they will come out either random or block color, depending on what stitch you use as well. So generally, if you use a variegated thread, so something like this, or if you've got some Wonderfill, I've got a Halloween coloured one there called, I think it's called Boo. Variegated threads, if they're dyed in a block fashion, it means that they are consistent with their colour, so there'll be a repetition of the colour. So if you do a zigzag stitch or a quite close together stitch like that, you will get a block of each colour, so red, green, blue, red, green, blue, and it will appear in like a little chunk, and it will be consistent. If you've got a variegated thread that's been randomly dyed, you will have little bits of colour in all sorts of places. There won't be much consistency to it. It just depends on how you want it to look. So I don't mind the block colour. I actually think it looks really cute on some things. But the randomness sometimes is a really good effect too, depending on what you're doing. So have a think about your threads. When we get to stitching on the machine in a little bit, I'll explain a bit more about the thread and the stitch selection so that you can have a play with that. There is one thing that I will like to just pop in here that I've come across quite a bit over the last few years, and that is that people are keeping threads for far too long. So if you've got a spool of thread, or any of your spools of thread in your collection, and if you go and grab them and squeeze them and your fingers dip in, it's spongy, please throw that thread out. It just means that the thread is aged and it's relaxed on the spool, and it means that when you put that spool on your machine, it will unspool inconsistently and cause problems. So go through all your threads, give everything a bit of a squeeze. Anything that's soft and not sentimental, throw in the bin. Anything that's soft and sentimental, package up in a little memento box and put somewhere else so that it's not in your usable sewing stash. Other than that, you may also need, depending on what you've got at home, don't rush out and buy one of these, 12.5-inch square ruler. This is the size that all of our blocks will finish at, so anything we've got with a background, you can use one of these, just straight up square. Also possibly with our freezer paper technique, but if you've ever done any paper piecing, like English paper, you've done hexagons or things like that, there's different glues you can use. The Soline glue pen that I sell and things like that. You can also use Bostik's blue glue stick. I use this for machine embroidery as well, because sometimes I need the stabilizers in certain positions. So there's a couple of things there. I'll talk more about needles when we get to the machine, because it's just easier at that stage, and you will need scissors to cut everything out with. So I will set up spray starch like we discussed last month. I'm currently still using the peppermint one, so we'll see how we go with that. So I'm going to set up the 3 little samples. I'm going to do them all, the prep for all of them all together, and then I'll take all 3 to the machine when we get to that stage, just so that I'm filming a bit easier in this space. I don't have a lot of room in my craft room, so the tripod does take up a bit of space, so I'm just trying to work around that. But if you do have questions after you've watched the video, please let me know. If you need like close-up photos of anything or stills, like I'm quite happy to do those. So I'll get sorted and I will be back shortly. Okay, so as you can see here, I've got my 3 background fabrics, my Visifix, my freezer paper, my template, a pen. Normally I would just use a lead pencil, but lead doesn't show up very well on camera. The purple fabric is going to be my circles, and over in the back corner there are my iron-on interfacing and my stitch and tear. So what I'm going to do first is I want to, on the paper side of my freezer paper, trace my circle. So the shiny side of the freezer paper is on the bottom. My rough side of my visor fix onto my mat and trace my circle. Okay, so with the freezer paper, you want to cut out on the circle. So on that drawn line, and I will discuss the templates in a little bit of detail in a second. Now, when you are cutting shapes for applique, the recommendation is to hold the scissors still and move the shape into the blade. Circles are really good for this because it's just a slow pivot. Okay, so shiny side, wrong side. So we'll just pop that aside. Now with our visor fix, I don't want to cut on the line. I'm not ready for that yet, but I can neaten it up a bit so that I'm not fusing too much onto my paper. Now, if you were preparing these visor fix shapes for a project that you're not going to work on straight away, so say in a couple of days time from now, I would not trim it at all. And the reason being is visor fix does have a bit of it's a bit of a slippery slope. It does like to peel, and it peels quite easily. And the reason being is that it is lightweight. It's barely attached to its paper, and that's the whole point of it. But the thing is, it can expire. It can go off. So you need to, if you're going to buy some to use, you need to buy it as you need it for your projects. Unless you're someone like me who uses a lot of it, buy a whole roll. Now I think a whole roll is like 30 meters or something like that, so you need to be prepared to use it. So we've now got our two shapes that need to be ironed on to our fabric. Now, if you have usable scraps, put them somewhere safe. If not, in the bin. I like to be organized so things go straight where they need to go. Now, for our interfacing, all you need to do for it, and let me just check my measurements here. So with our circle for our bagging technique, now I've already pre-starched this fabric, so your shiny side of your interfacing and the right side of your fabric go together, and then onto the wrong side of your fabric. Now, if your interfacing is a light color, you can by all means trace onto it, but as mine is dark, I'm just going to go onto here and just trace. Now all you need to do is pop a couple of pins in, and then that's ready, prepped as well. So you don't have to overpin, just a few just to hold it in place. Okay, now these will go over to the iron, and we will iron these both to the wrong side of the fabric. But before we do that, I just want to talk about these templates so you can see. These templates come in, so it's sets of circles, and they are from our tiny little 1 inch up to our large 8 inch. Now the reason why I like this particular set is because they come in 1/2 inch increments. So that's the stack there. But they have a center marking, so you can pop your pen, your marking pen in the center and find your center. You've got nice crosshairs, and you've got your 1/4 inch seam allowance around the outside edge. So the reason that I like those markings is that it means I don't have to muck around if I need to find anything. So if I wanted to mark my circle for whatever reason, I can pop it down, I can get my pen, and I can go, I've got my center, and I can do a little notch at each of the 4 quadrants, and I'm ready to go. If you were interested in these sets, I will pop all the information in the description below for you, and I can order them in for you. They're currently on, they're on order at the moment. As with COVID still happening, there's still a few logistics issues for some things, so I'll have to check if they are in stock. So this set I love, I use for lots of different things. I'm not big on buying templates, I must admit, but I do use the circle set quite often. For other shapes, I will just wander around my house and find things, so dinner plates and mugs and stuff like that before I bought these. But otherwise you can use anything that takes your fancy, or you can use images out of kids colouring in books and things like that, or vector art that's not copyrighted off the internet, and go from there. Okay, so we will just pop over to the iron and iron these two on. Okay, so here you can see I've got my freezer paper and my Visifix. Now, the freezer paper has a waxy coating on it, so all you're doing by heating it up is just melting that wax coating just so it adheres slightly to your fabric. It's a temporary bond, and we will be removing that circle shortly. So, Visifix first, because it's our easiest one. You take your scissors and you cut on the drawn line. Now, Visifix is pretty much a go-to. It's a staple for applique. It's one of those things. This is for raw edge applique, and the reason being is because we're cutting on the drawn line. It is literally the size that we have here. Now, usually with shapes you would peel from the edge, but we don't want to fray any of our edges there. So what I suggest you do is grab a pin and score the back of what you're working on, and then you can just peel and the glue stays on, and that way you're not fraying any of those edges of your shape. Now if it doesn't stick, now see this here, this is the mesh that is the Visifix. If it doesn't stick, just take it back to the iron and touch it again with the iron, but don't touch any of the exposed glue. You then need to give it a chance to cool, so that you're not peeling hot glue. So just give it a chance to cool and then score again and peel. Now this might happen to you for a variety of reasons. It could be that your Visifix is a little bit old. It could be that it started to lift away from the fabric. It could be that your iron wasn't hot enough. So now it is ready to go, and we can pop it onto our background fabric. So in order for us to find the center, just finger press your background square into quarters. Do the same with your circle, but don't fold it so that the Visifix is on the inside, because sometimes it can stick to itself. So just fold your quadrants. See how it just sticks a fraction? And then line up your fold marks with the fold marks that are on your background fabric, and then iron that in place. Then take your stitch and tear, pop it behind, and pop a few pins in place. So I'll just go and do that. Okay, so our circle is attached, our stitch and tear is pinned in position. It's now ready to sew. This one is now ready to sew. So what we'll do is I'm going to prep everything so that we're ready to go. Now, the fun one. Your freezer paper is only a temporary hold. So if you find that it does move a little bit, if you need to whack a little bit of the blue glue on it just to hold it in place while you do this step, that's fine. The blue glue does wash out. All you need to do is eyeball and cut around your shape with a rough 1/4 of an inch. If you feel uncomfortable that small, you can give it a little bit more. So just eyeball it. Now, what we need to do here is we need to spray this with spray starch, and then we need to press this so that it's all around the edge. So I'm going okay, so here we have our freezer paper, spray starch. Now you're going to have to give it a fair bit, unfortunately. And then what we're going to do is you're just going to press, and you're going to have to work and be careful of your fingers, of course. So if you need to wear gloves or thimbles or anything to protect your fingers, by all means do that. So because this is a circle, we're going to have to work around it. If you have a mini iron, that's also a good. A mini iron will give you good maneuverability. So as you can see here, we're just slowly starting to get this nice curve here, and we're just going to work our way around. And the edge of the freezer paper is giving us the crisp edge that we're looking for. Now, if you're not a fan of steam, by all means turn it off on your iron. So I'm just going to continue to do this, and I will be back in a moment. Okay, here we've ironed all the way around. Don't put any more spray starch on it, but do make sure you give everything a nice press. You want that edge to be super crisp. And now what we can do is, because we've got our nice edge that we are going to hand sew all the way around, we can remove our freezer paper shape. So all you need to do is just lift and gently pull it out. This shape can be reused a couple of times, but after that the wax tends to run out. So you can see how sort of crinkly it goes a bit. Now what you want to do is make sure that those creases stay there, and just press and hold. Do not push your iron because you may move that shape. So now this is ready to hand sew on our background. Okay, as with before, we need to finger press and find our center. And then you can do the same thing for your circle, but just be careful you don't push those seams out of position. So once we have our spot, we can find our position, and you can pin that in place. Now with your needle turn, if you do not want to hand sew this, you can machine sew it. However, because it is not attached to your background fabric, you may find it may shift a little. So if you're going to machine sew your edge, you'd be better off just doing your visor fix one, but that is totally up to you. So now we are at a point where I can take all three of these to the machine and show you the different options that we have for these. Okay, so here we are ready to start sewing, but we've got a couple of decisions to make first. So first and foremost, depending on what thread you decide to use, is what needle you're going to use. Now, generally most people have probably got a universal 80 in their machine. Now that is fine to use for your raw edge applique, and when you sew this circle for the bagging technique. The only thing I would suggest though is if you are going to use a fancier thread, so your variegated and your shiny threads and things like that, is to have a play with the needle, because sometimes the universal needle can leave a bigger hole on your appliques, and you don't necessarily want big gaping holes on the edge of your stitching. So Traditionally, I like to use a Microtex 60/8. Now, that is one of the finest needles you can use. The only problem that I have come across with it is that because it is so fine and the eye is so tiny, is that your needle threader on your machine will not thread it. So if you have trouble seeing, this is not the needle for you. But if you want to go up a size, go to the 70 or the 90. They are still a fine needle. I have not tested them with the needle threader on my machine, but I assume it's the same problem until you hit about size 90. If you are wanting to use, if you're using like threads that are a bit thicker, or if you've got metallic or something like that, I would recommend using a Jeans 80. So Jeans 80 instead of a Jeans 90, because you want the smaller size needle so it doesn't leave big holes again, or the top stitch needle so that you can use it with the bigger eye for your different threads. So it's all a bit of experimentation. There are some rules when it comes to threads and needle sizes and things like that, but I'm more of the mind of testing some of these things as opposed to following some of the rules, because the thing is, you might find that if you follow the rules, it gives you one look, but if you follow your own idea, it might give you something that you prefer the end result of better. So by all means, follow the rules, but if you find something works better for you without following a rule, go for it too. So first and foremost, we are not sewing our needle turn. I will show you a couple of hand stitches on it, but I'm not going to sit in front of the camera and hand sew it for you. So we can put that one aside. What I currently want to do is I want to thread up my machine, and I want to stitch my bagged one so you can see the method of that, and then I will get into the applique stitches for the other one. So I've got my thread, I've got my 1/4 inch foot on because I want the guide, and the reason being is because we're actually going to stitch the entire circle so it gets closed. Now you may think, how on earth? We'll get to that. So needle down, straight stitch the automatic on your machine. So mine's a 2.2 stitch, that's perfectly acceptable. I want to do a tiny reverse, and I'm going to stitch on that line, and I'm going to pivot ever so gently and follow that line all the way around. You need to stay on this line, and it needs to be smooth, so no pointy start stops or pivot points, because when we turn it out, it's going to be a perfect circle. That is the whole point of this one. Now, one thing I did forget to mention earlier, by doing this bagging technique and the needle turn applique technique, you do lose seam allowance. Your raw edge applique is the only one that gives you the exact size of the circle that you trace. So if you do want a specific size circle, you need to ensure that you've covered your seam allowance as well. So now I'm back at the beginning, and I'm just going to do my little reverse, cut the threads and trim my starting threads. And then I'm going to take my pins out, and I'm going to trim approximately 1/4 inch all the way around my circle. Now, if you feel like 1/4 inch is not enough for the next step, by all means make it a little bit bigger, but don't give it too much because it is bulk. So just rough cut all the way around. Get rid of your scraps into your scrap bin or into your rubbish bin. Now I use these Fiskars snips because they're spring loaded, they're a lot easier on my hands. And we are going to notch all the way around our circle. So just notch it. Don't cut into where the stitches are. You can get close, but don't go all the way in, otherwise you will cut your stitches. So notch all the way around, and then that one will be ready for the next step. Now, I know I'm jumping in between the three different methods, but I just feel like because I've got bits and pieces going everywhere for you. So now, we are moving on to our applique circle with the machine stitching. So this is our raw edge. Now, I'm going to show you using the flat colour first, and then I'll move on to some other threads so you can see the difference. This foot here is my F2 open toe foot. There is nothing in this center part here. There is a tiny little notch here at the back where the foot clips onto the ankle onto the machine, and that's my only guide. And the reason why I love this foot as opposed to its brother foot, which has a guide in the front across here, is that I can see more. Now, if you need the guide, by all means use the guide. I find that it actually causes more hindrance than help, so I prefer this foot. So my machine is a Janome Horizon. It's a 7700 QCP. It's a memory craft, and I use the F2 foot. Now, my quadrants on my fabric here, I'm just going to pop a little mark. So this is just for me, this is not for anything that you would be doing. So I'm just giving myself a little mark so I know where to start and stop. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick stitch 9 on this machine, which is my zigzag. Now, when I click on this stitch normally, it comes out with a width of 5 and a length of 1.5. Now, I don't like that setting, so I'm going to change it to my favorite, which is a width of 2.5 and a length of 0.2. Now, the reason I like this stitch is because it is nice and close. It's small, so if you're using like fine shapes, like you've got lots of fine points on things and whatever, it's a nice little stitch to use. Now, I also like to start with the needle on the left hand side, and the reason for that is because it's on the inside edge of my applique shape, and then I can eyeball the distance that it's going to jump onto the background fabric. Now, I count stitches, not every single stitch like 1 to 100, but I count roughly half a dozen or so, so I know when to pivot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how this stitch comes out, but then I'm also going to show you this stitch in a variegated thread. So what I'm watching here is the very edge of the applique. Just get my awl. So the very edge of the applique is lining up with the notch at the back of the foot. And when the needle stops in the right hand position, I know that it's going to be 2.5 millimeter from the needle to the edge of the fabric. And I'm watching where the edge starts to curve off and disappear out of that alignment. And when I hit certain points, so when it starts to get out of the alignment, I know when to pivot. And this will be, I like to pivot when it's on the left hand side. So I would move my needle over one tiny stitch, and then I will just adjust what I'm sewing until the front part of this shape is back in alignment with the notch on the foot. And I will keep pivoting to get that so every stitch is perpendicular to the curve of my shape. Now, if you have a knee lever on your machine, you could use it instead of lifting the foot manually with your hand. Okay, so I'm going to just stop there so you can have a look at how close and how pretty that stitch is. Now, it's just a zigzag, and I've just fiddled with it till I got it to the size that I liked. So now I'm just going to pop over to my variegated thread and show you what I was talking about with the block colour. So block colour can look really pretty, can also look a bit clumpy. So I do suggest that you test your colour of your variegated thread on your on some of your background fabric or your applique fabric before you work on your actual project. And the reason for that is that sometimes the contrast is not what you want. Variegated threads can throw differently depending on what fabric color they are on. The one that I'm currently using comes up beautifully on grey fabric but looks terrible on a couple of other fabrics. Okay, so currently my needle is in the left position, but I'm going to just start with that anyway because I can use the other stitching as my eyeball. So this is a signature thread. It's called Garden, and it's in a blue and purple run. It's really pretty. Looks beautiful with machine quilting. Now, because I've had a fair bit of practice at this, I do sometimes pivot as I'm stitching, so I don't always lift the foot and stitch separately. So here we go with the variegated thread, and see what I mean about the block. So there's a tiny bit of pale blue, this aqua and navy, then into the magenta with a touch of hot pink in the center there, back into the navy, a touch of that aqua, and then light blue again. So this is not consistently dyed. So that is zigzag. So if you choose to do your applique like this, the method that I like to use to secure it is I like to pull my top thread to the back. I tie it in a reef knot, so right over left, left over right, and then trim my threads. Now, if you feel like that's not secure enough for you, you can put a dab of fray stopper or something like that on that knot there, but I do find that it's quite fine as it is. Now, if you chop off your ends, you will find that eventually your threads will pull. So please pull everything to the back and ensure that you are tying everything off properly. Don't use the reverse on your machine for your zigzag, because what you'll do is you'll get like a little lump at the start and the stop, and it's not attractive, and then you can tell where you've started and stopped. So that is that one there. Now, what I'm going to do for this next one is I'm going to leave the variegated thread on, and I'm going to show you a decorative stitch that moves forwards and backwards and side to side. So this is when you can start playing with all of those fabulous decorative stitches that are on some of your machines. Now, if you've got a very basic machine, you may not have 300 odd stitches to choose from, but you will have some interesting stitches. So have a look at how a stitch forms. Get a scrap of fabric and stitch some of them out. Make sure you put a bit of your stitch and tear underneath so that you get the true reading of what the stitch is. And have a look at what the shapes of the stitches are. Now, because we're doing an applique and we have a center line that we can follow, which is the edge of our fabric, have a look at stitches that have a center line. So I've got one here that does look like, let's call it a chain of leaves. So what it is I'm looking for where that center line could come down off the stitch, and then the stitch can work into the fabric and off into the background. So we've got one that's leaves, I've got hearts and stars and different vines and things like that. So I think I'm going to use leaves to show you. So I've got stitch 180. Okay. Now, this is, I'm going to leave the stitch at exactly the size that it comes off the machine. I'm not going to fiddle with it. If I was working on my proper project, I would do some stitch test and see what it looked like and go from there. So I'm lining up the notch on the back of my foot, again with the edge of my applique. Needle down, and then just let it stitch. I am still using my open toe foot because I want to be able to see where this is going. Now I'm trying to keep the center of my vine as much on the center of the applique as possible. Now you may struggle on curves with this, but the thing is, it's decorative. It's going to move around, it's going to look like you've sort of sketched it over the top of the edge of your applique. It's probably the best. So I'm just pivoting this. I'm going slowly, I could go slower, but I'm just pivoting this as it moves so that I can keep an eye on the center of that vine. Now, the reason why I'm using the open toe foot, not only for the visibility, is because a lot of these decorative stitches want to move forwards and backwards, side to side, because that's how the stitches are programmed. Now, if you were to use something like your walking foot, really isn't designed to go backwards. And the reason for that is because it's a walking foot. It's meant to walk forward. So if you find you're using a walking foot for all of these things and it's not doing what you want it to do, that may be the reason. Okay, so I'm just on the last leaf here. If you have an end pattern button on your machine, you can press that and it will finish for you. I generally just eyeball things because I'm so used to doing it, so that's one of those. So I'll just cut the threads here. So here I have, in the variegated thread, my nice little leaf pattern just moving around the edge of my circle. Now the center line actually shifts left and right, so it's not going to be completely on that framework, but I still like the way it looks. Okay, our next stitch, some of you may have seen this before. I have done it with the dragonfly quilt that I was teaching a couple of years ago. If you just want to do a straight line and follow the shape of your applique shape, you can use the default stitch setting. You just want to come in a fraction off the edge of your applique shape, and you just want to stitch slowly around the edge. Now you could do it once, however I find that 3 times is the perfect number. So what I do is I just go over it. Now if you were doing this circle fully, you'd go around it 3 times rather than turning around, of course. Now with the variegated thread it will change colour, and it will do all sorts of things. If you want to blend it in, you can use your flat colour. So that is one other option. Now this one's quite quick to do, but if you don't want to have that effect, try something different. Now the last one I'm going to do is your blanket stitch. So on my machine, blanket stitch is stitch 45, which is a right-sided blanket stitch, which means it's going to bite into my circle. And by bite I mean that's the stitch that it turns, that it stitches into the center of my shape. Now if I was fiddling around with other things, now it comes out at 2.5 mils wide, sorry, and 2.5 deep. Now I don't think 2.5 wide is quite what I want, so I'm going to jump up to 3.5 and I'll leave it at 2.5 and we'll see what it looks like. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to stitch with this variegated thread because it does give a really nice effect with the blanket stitch. Now blanket stitch likes to move in a funny way, so I'm just going to line up my needle here because I want to run the straight stitch of the blanket stitch, so the one that moves forward, on the background fabric, and the bite needs to go inside. So in it goes, and I'm just pivoting ever so slightly, and stitch slowly so you can monitor this one. Now what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to adjust the stitch, the jump, sorry. So the bite of how the jump goes, I'm going to match it at 3.5 so you can see the difference. So blanket stitch. So this here is the 2.5 by 3.5. So 2.5 is the jump from stitch to stitch, and the 3.5 goes in. And here I've changed it to 3.5 and 3.5, so it's more square, and you can see the gap is bigger here. So they're the 4 stitch options that you can pick for your raw edge applique. Any thread preference and any stitch preference, and you will get a different look every time. Now when you're ready, your stitch and tear on the back will just peel away. Secure the stitches with your fingernail, and just so you could give them a bit of support, and then just break away. It's all perforated, and any that does remain in between will eventually disintegrate and come out in the wash over time. Sometimes it doesn't, and depending on what stitch and tear you buy, but most of the time it will just wear away after time. So that's your options there. Now we go back to the cutting table, and I will show you, or actually we're going to go back to the ironing board, we'll make it easier, and I will show you our last circle. Okay, here we have our bagged circle. It's all been notched. We have our last square with our finger pressed markings, and what I want you to do is I want you to take your scissors, separate, and just make a small incision in your interfacing. I then want you to cut towards the north, south, east, west, but not all the way to the edge, and it doesn't have to be perfect. So we want this kind of pie shaped looking thing. I want you to flip everything out. Now if you've got a turning tool, if your fingers are not that great and things like that, by all means use that. We want to make sure all of our seams are rolled out, and nice and flat, and we then want to fold our circle to get our quadrants. Don't iron anything yet. So then we've now got our quadrants, and we can line up our corner, come down here, corner. Make sure all those edges are nice and rolled out. Now, this is the point where you need to make a decision. If you are going to hand sew this and you don't want to do anything else but fuse it on and hand sew it, that's fine. You will find that your fabric is a little bit baggy in the center, so if you want to put an embellishment like a button or do some quilting in it to hold it in place, you can. If you want this circle to be more puffy, you can insert a piece of wadding inside. If you want to fuse the circle to the interfacing, you need to put a small piece of Visor-Fix in there as well. I'm going to quilt mine when I get to the very end of this project, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it as is. I'm actually not even going to hand sew it, I'm just fusing the circle in place. So I've lined up my quadrants, the seams are rolled out. So just press and hold for a second to activate the glue on your interfacing. And then your circle has been adhered to your background fabric, and then you can do the next step, whether you do machine applique, hand applique, or if you want to leave it until the end like I am and quilt it. And you'll see on the back, you can see the shadow of your circle, and you can see here that the circle is not attached to the internal part. It's just the interfacing that's attached to the background fabric, and if you do want to secure that further or make it look puffy, you can do what I mentioned earlier. So it's not attached there, you can see. So that is the 3 options for your applique circle. Whichever one you choose, totally up to you. So we have bagged technique with attachment options, Fix with stitch selection and thread options, freezer paper, hand sewing. So with your hand sewing, I'll just use this needle here, what you would be doing is just catching the background fabric and a tiny bit of your edge and doing a stitch like that, as invisible as possible, and it will be beautifully done. So I hope you all enjoyed the 3 different options to make the circle applique block for February. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. If you've got anything that you need to order, let me know as well. But we will be back next month with March's mystery block. Who knows what that's going to be. But in the meantime, just stay in touch. If you do have any questions, suggestions, thoughts, feelings, whatever, please let me know, and we will see you next time. Bye for now.